The sun had barely risen, yet the sky above the small town remained pale and silent, as if morning had forgotten to arrive. At the edge of the deserted neighborhood stood an old, weathered school building, Hillview Elementary. Its walls were cracked, its paint had peeled away long ago, and the faint sound of wind whistling through the broken windows echoed down its empty halls. Inside classroom number 7, 7 children sat quietly in their wooden desks, their backpacks pressed against their feet. None of them spoke. Their eyes kept darting toward the large, antique clock on the wall, a clock that hadn't ticked in years. The air felt heavier than usual, and a strange chill crept through the room, even though the heater buzzed weakly in the corner. Suddenly, the classroom door creaked open. A tall woman stepped in, wearing a long gray dress and a shawl that brushed against the floor. Her name was Miss Sarah, the new teacher assigned to the class. She smiled, but something about that smile felt too still. Her eyes were calm, yet strangely empty, as though she were seeing something none of the children could. "Good morning, children," she said softly, her voice echoing more than it should have. "Good morning, Miss Sarah." The children replied in unison, though a few voices trembled. She walked slowly to the blackboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and began to write the lesson of the day, light and shadows. But as the words appeared, the chalk in her hand broke, not once, but 3 times, and the final word on the board began to fade, erasing itself letter by letter. Outside, a cold gust rattled the windows. The children looked around nervously. Miss Sarah turned slowly toward them, that same silent smile frozen on her face. And then, without warning, the clock on the wall ticked once. After years of silence, the morning inside classroom number 7 dragged on like a dream that refused to end. Miss Sarah stood before the children, her posture straight, her hands clasped tightly around a piece of chalk. She seemed calm, too calm. Her every movement was slow, deliberate, like she was mimicking how a human should act. The children sat frozen in their seats. None of them dared to whisper. Something about their new teacher didn't feel right. Her eyes didn't blink often. Her breath never showed in the cold air, unlike theirs. She turned toward the class and said softly, "Today, we'll learn about light and shadows." Her voice carried a strange echo, as though it came from deep within the walls rather than her throat. A shiver ran through the children. One of them, Lena, glanced toward the window, but outside was still pitch black, even though it should have been mid-morning. Miss Sarah began to draw something on the blackboard. At first, it looked like a simple circle, but as her hand moved, the lines twisted, spreading into shapes that didn't belong in any lesson. Crooked symbols that seemed to pulse faintly like veins under the skin. Lena raised her hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, what are those?" Miss Sarah turned her head slowly, her eyes locking on Lena's. Her lips curled into that same too-perfect smile. "These," she whispered, "are shadows that never die." The chalk fell from her fingers and rolled across the floor, stopping right beside Lena's shoe. Then, for the first time, Miss Sarah blinked, once. When her eyes opened again, they were completely black. The lights flickered, the heater went silent, and behind every child's desk, a faint shadow began to move on its own. The next morning, classroom number 7 was colder than before. The students entered quietly, their shoes echoing in the hollow silence. Dust floated through the air like tiny spirits, glowing faintly in the dim light from the window. Miss Sarah stood near the blackboard, facing the wall. Her back was turned to the class, her hair draped down like a curtain. She didn't greet the children. She didn't move. She just stood there. After a long, uneasy minute, one boy whispered, "Ma'am?" Without turning, she raised her hand and began writing, slow, graceful strokes. But her hand wasn't holding any chalk. The words appeared on the board by themselves, one letter at a time, as if an invisible hand was carving them into the surface. The children gasped. The sound of scratching filled the room, high-pitched, like nails on stone. When the writing stopped, the sentence on the board read, "They see you." Miss Sarah lowered her arm and turned around. Her smile was faint, but her eyes looked glassy, reflecting something moving behind the children. Lena turned to look, but there was nothing, just the empty classroom and their trembling reflections in the windows. Suddenly, the blackboard started erasing itself. The dust from the chalk formed shapes in the air, tiny faces screaming without sound. Miss Sarah clapped her hands once. Let's continue, she said softly. Her tone was cheerful, but her shadow on the wall was moving differently from her body. The bell rang early that day, but no one remembered hearing it ring. The fourth morning arrived with heavy clouds pressing low over the sky. Yet when the children reached the school, the sunlight still refused to come. It was as though the world beyond the gates had forgotten the concept of day. Inside classroom number 7, every window was covered with frost. Miss Sarah was already there, arranging books that looked decades old. Today, she said softly, we learn about the world outside. Her smile didn't match her words. One of the students, Amir, looked out the nearest window and froze. Ma'am, he whispered, there's nothing out there. The others followed his gaze. Beyond the glass, there was no playground, no trees, just endless darkness. The wind that used to blow through the courtyard was gone. It felt like the whole school was floating in a black void. Miss Sarah walked over to the window, her shoes clicking softly on the floor. She touched the glass, and where her hand met it, frost spread like veins, spelling faint, shifting words no one could understand. Don't be afraid, she said, her reflection smiling even wider than her real face. This is where the light hides when it's scared. The lights in the classroom flickered. Every child's reflection in the window disappeared, except Miss Sarah's. Then came a faint knock on the window from the other side. Once, twice, thrice. Miss Sarah turned slowly toward the children, whispering, they've come to learn too. The knock grew louder, like hundreds of small hands tapping from the dark. And suddenly, all the windows shattered at once, filling the air with a freezing scream. By the fifth morning, the air in classroom number 7 felt heavier, like breathing through water. The heater no longer worked, yet the room wasn't cold. It was still, too still. The children sat stiff in their chairs. Their eyes kept darting toward the window, where darkness pressed thick against the glass. Not night, not fog, just nothingness. Finally, one of the younger students, Hassan, gathered the courage to speak. Ma'am, he said in a shaky voice, why isn't there any sunlight anymore? Miss Sarah, who had been writing strange curved symbols on the board, froze. Slowly, her hand lowered. Her back remained facing the class, but her voice floated through the room, soft and cold. This school, she whispered, only learns in darkness. A chill rippled through the room. The lights above flickered. Hassan frowned, thinking it was a joke, but when Miss Sarah turned around, she was smiling too widely, her teeth faintly shining in the dim light. No one learns under the sun, she added, because the light sees too much. The words didn't make sense, but every child felt something shift, a deep hum in the floor, as though the school itself had taken a breath. Suddenly, the blackboard began to shake. The symbols she had written started glowing faintly red, and the air filled with the faint sound of whispering. Hundreds of overlapping voices speaking in a language no one knew. Hassan screamed, and the sound broke the spell. The lights snapped back on, and Miss Sarah simply blinked, her smile gone. Page 13, she said calmly. Let's continue. But as the children opened their books, every page was black. The next day began with thunder rumbling somewhere far above the blackened sky. The children entered classroom number 7 more reluctantly than ever. Miss Sarah was already there, humming a slow, tuneless melody that made the air vibrate. Good morning, she said. But her voice sounded different, deeper, layered, like two people speaking at once. Lena exchanged a nervous look with Amir. Ma'am, are you okay? She asked softly. Miss Sarah tilted her head slightly. Of course, dear, she replied. But when she spoke, her lips barely moved. The sound seemed to come from behind her, from the walls, or the ceiling. She began the lesson, reading from an old book whose pages looked burnt around the edges. Her words echoed strangely, and with each line she read, the lights dimmed a little more. Then came the smell of smoke, faint but real. Amir pointed at the ceiling. Ma'am, something's burning. Miss Sarah looked up, her eyes glowing faintly orange. No, she said, smiling. That's just the light trying to come in. The humming in the air grew louder, like a swarm of bees trapped inside the walls. The children covered their ears, but the sound came from inside their heads now, pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeats. And then Miss Sarah screamed, a sound too deep, too distorted to belong to a human throat. The windows cracked, the desks rattled, and the lights went out completely. When the emergency bulb flickered back to life, Miss Sarah was standing perfectly still again, her smile gentle and warm. "As I was saying," she whispered, "we'll continue with the story of shadows tomorrow." The children didn't move. No one dared to blink, because the voice that spoke that last line wasn't hers. By the seventh day, the classroom didn't feel like part of the world anymore. The windows showed nothing, no sky, no trees, no light. Just endless black fog pressing against the glass. The students barely spoke now. They only stared at Miss Sarah, who stood at the front of the room, motionless for several minutes before speaking. Her skin looked pale, almost gray under the dim light, and her shadow on the wall seemed larger than her body. "Today," she said slowly, "we'll learn about the things that live between the seconds." Her words made no sense, but the children listened, unable to look away. As she spoke, her voice grew lower, stretched thin, and echoed in ways that didn't match her lips. Then, the first strange thing happened. A faint mist began to pour from her eyes. At first, the children thought it was smoke from the heater. But soon, black vapor coiled out of her eye sockets, swirling upward like dark ribbons. Lena gasped, "Ma'am, your eyes." Miss Sarah blinked slowly. Her smile never wavered. "Don't be afraid, children," she said. "The shadows are only learning too." The smoke spread across the ceiling, forming shapes that looked like faces, hundreds of them, screaming silently. The light bulbs shattered one by one. When the last bulb broke, the classroom fell into darkness. Only Miss Sarah's voice remained, soft, calm, and wrong. "Now close your eyes," she whispered, "and let the dark see you." Then, everything went still. The next day, the students entered classroom number 7 without a word. Miss Sarah was sitting at her desk, her head bowed, hands folded neatly. She wasn't moving. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of burnt chalk and something metallic. Amir stepped forward first. "Ma'am," he whispered. No answer. Lena approached cautiously, her shoes squeaking on the old wooden floor. She reached out and froze. Miss Sarah's body was ice cold. Her pulse was gone. "Ma'am," Lena said again, shaking her shoulder. The teacher's head fell to the side, eyes half open, staring at nothing. Panic spread like fire. The children screamed, running to the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't even move. Then, from behind them, a voice spoke, the same soft tone they had heard every day. "Children." They turned around. Miss Sarah's body was still slumped over the desk, but the voice came from above, from the ceiling. Dark smoke leaked downward, twisting in midair, shaping itself into her face. The same calm smile, floating like a nightmare. "You shouldn't have tried to wake me," she whispered. "I was still teaching." The desks began to shake. The blackboard cracked in half, and the windows bled a thick, inky liquid that dripped onto the floor. The children fell to their knees, covering their ears as whispers filled the room, chanting their names, one by one. Miss Sarah's lifeless body suddenly gasped, air rushing into her lungs like a scream in reverse. Her eyes snapped open, pure black, burning with shadow. And then she stood, smiling as though nothing had happened. "Now," she said gently, "where were we?" The classroom was silent except for the faint creak of the ceiling fan, turning slower than before. Miss Sarah had collapsed onto her desk, her face hidden in her arms. The children stood frozen, unsure if they should move or run. Lena, her voice trembling, whispered, "Ma'am, are you okay?" No answer. Amir stepped closer, shaking her shoulder gently. Her body was cold, not the kind of cold that comes from air, but from something far deeper. "Ma'am, please wake up," he cried. Still nothing. Then the lights flickered, and a long, low hum filled the room. The air began to move, though no windows were open. The children looked around. Their shadows on the walls were moving, stretching, twisting. Lena screamed, "Look, the shadows, they're not ours." From under Miss Sarah's desk, a faint whisper echoed. It sounded like someone laughing, not from a throat, but from deep inside the walls. Amir stumbled backward. "She's breathing," he shouted. But it wasn't breathing. It was the sound of wind being pulled inward, like the entire room was inhaling through her. Papers flew off desks. The windows cracked. And then Miss Sarah's head slowly lifted. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open, eyes still closed. Yet her voice spoke clearly. "Did I fall asleep?" The children backed away in terror. Her eyes opened, but this time, there were no pupils. Only swirling darkness, alive and watching. The classroom door slammed shut. Miss Sarah smiled faintly, whispering, "You should never wake something that's dreaming." The air in classroom number 7 felt wrong, too hot and too cold at the same time. The lights flickered endlessly, casting the children's terrified faces in flashes of red and white. Miss Sarah stood in front of them, her skin now faintly cracked like old porcelain, her eyes black as oil. Amir stammered, "You're not human." She smiled slowly, her lips splitting slightly at the corners. "Human," she echoed softly. "No, children. Humans forget. But I remember every name ever whispered in this room." The blackboard behind her began to write by itself again, one word repeating over and over in thick, jagged letters. "Remember." Lena fell to her knees, covering her ears. "Please," she cried, "let us go." Miss Sarah tilted her head, her long hair floating as if underwater. "Go? But the lesson isn't over." The room began to shake violently. Desks overturned, windows shattered, and the floor cracked open beneath their feet, revealing faint red light glowing from below, like fire breathing beneath the school. From the cracks, dark smoke rose, wrapping around Miss Sarah's body like a living cloak. Her shape shifted, taller, sharper, monstrous. The voice that came next was no longer hers. It was layered, ancient, echoing in every corner. "I was summoned here long ago, to teach those who dare to learn in the dark." The children screamed, rushing toward the door, but it vanished into the wall. There was no exit anymore. Miss Sarah, or what had once been her, floated above the ground, eyes blazing like burning coals. Her final words hissed through the darkness. Class dismissed. The lights exploded, and the entire building fell silent once more. When rescue workers arrived the next day, classroom number 7 was empty. Only the words on the blackboard remained. They never stopped learning. Some say, if you walk past the old school at night, you can still hear her voice calling attendance. Lena, Amir, Hassan, because classroom number 7 was never closed. It just found new students in the dark. Would you dare to sit in her class? Skull like speech balloon, comment, bell, subscribe. For more dark, chilling horror stories that don't end when the bell rings.